are premises and ideas. What makes a reason bad? How can your idea or your premise be a bad reason? One way to have bad reasoning is if you're using two unrelated ideas as if they are related. Hi, we were wondering, what made you take an umbrella? I thought it was gonna rain. Right. And what made you think it was going to rain? I had a dream that it was gonna rain.
For Jill, the underlying reason why she's ultimately going to take an umbrella is that she had a bad dream last night. She thought her day was going to be ruined because she dreamt that it rained. So she dreamt that it was raining, and when she wakes up, she thinks, oh, it's going to rain. And because she thinks it's going to rain, she's going to take an umbrella. Another way to have bad reasoning is to use false statements. Dogs don't eat fruit. You shouldn't give your dog a watermelon. They don't eat watermelon.
You're on tape, buddy. It's a video of a dog eating a watermelon.
You don't even have to find out what's true or false before you can find out what's bad reasoning. Another way to find out what's bad reasoning is to look at the structure of the argument. Just like we have valid argument structures like modus ponens, where whatever you plug in, whatever content you're using will give you a valid argument. There's also invalid argument structures. Those will lead to bad reasoning no matter what you plug in, no matter what content you're using. Your argument will be bad and you'll have bad reasoning if you have those structures for your arguments. Here in premise 1, we have if P, then Q. In other words, if the antecedent, then the consequent. And premise 2 is putting the antecedent as true, then the conclusion is the consequent. Anything you plug in for modus ponens will be valid, although maybe not sound, because this is a valid argument form. This is a fallacy. It's bad reasoning. It's affirming the consequent. So here we have the same conditional statement, if P, then Q. And premise 2 says Q. It affirms the consequent. And the conclusion looks like it would be P. This kind of reasoning, affirming the consequent, is on our list of big no-nos. No matter what you're talking about, if you have that invalid structure for your argument, you will have bad reasoning. Let's have an example. Here's an example of bad reasoning according to the fallacy of affirming the consequent. Baking potatoes before eating them means not eating raw potatoes. So the not eating raw potatoes is the consequent of the antecedent, which is baking potatoes. I know it's not in perfect if-then form. The second premise that you might say here, I'm not eating raw potatoes, and from that you conclude that you must have baked the potatoes. So what did we do? We affirmed the consequent. We said, I'm not eating raw potatoes, and then we went backwards. Oh, well, we must have baked the potatoes. But baking your potatoes is just one way to have potatoes that are not raw. You didn't necessarily have to bake them to eat them not raw. So it's not true that you must have baked them. There's a number of other ways to eat potatoes that are not raw. Of course, baking them is sufficient to have not raw potatoes, but it's not necessary. Boiling potatoes would be sufficient to eat not raw potatoes. Of course, boiling them are not necessary. So it would be a fallacy to affirm the consequent and say just because you're eating potatoes that are not raw, you must have baked them. If your car is out of fuel, then it won't work. That's actually true. So for a second, ignore the birds. That's making me dizzy because nothing makes sense because this is a fallacy. Then go to the second premise where we affirm the consequent. Now the birds arrive. So we're saying that the car won't work. That's affirming the consequent. Then their conclusion is, so the car must be out of fuel. We're saying that the car won't work, so it must be out of fuel. That's not true. That's not necessarily true. That's not logically true. Because, like the sweet potatoes, there's a number of different reasons why your car won't work. Just because it won't work does not guarantee that it's out of fuel. Now, if it's out of fuel, it won't work. That's a sufficient reason for your car not working. But just because you have affirmed the consequent does not mean that the truth of your conclusion is guaranteed. And that's what a valid argument form is. A valid argument form means whatever content you're using, you will have a true conclusion guaranteed so long as your premises are true. That's not the case with this argument, because that's not the case with this form. This is an invalid argument form. We call it affirming the consequent, because the truth of the conclusion is not guaranteed, not even if both of your premises are true. This is a valid argument form called disjunctive syllogism. The argument, no matter what you plug in for A or B, as long as you're consistent, will be valid. However, we can really screw it up by giving a false dichotomy into premise 1, as it is here, by saying things that aren't actually true. For example, either you're with us or you're against us. And then by saying, oh, well, if you're not with us, then you are against us. Conclusion, you're against us. That's a false dichotomy. In premise 1, the reasoning is bad, but you might actually be against us. So even if somebody is arguing that somebody is the enemy, using a bad argument, they might still be right. It's bad reasoning to think that somebody's conclusion is false because they have a false premise. You can have a false premise, you can have bad reasoning, and you still might be right on accident, of course. It's not because of the argument that you're right, but it's bad reasoning to assume somebody's conclusion has to be false because they have a false premise. That's not true. See it in this other case. It might actually be true that your car is out of fuel, even though in this argument you affirm the consequent, which is a big no-no in logic. So even though your reasoning might be poor, the conclusion might accidentally be true. And it's bad reasoning to think that somebody is wrong ultimately just because they have bad starting points. You and I both know that the only thing making Jill take an umbrella is what she dreamt last night. But she could still be right about it raining.